I want to differentiate the functional components for the Security Operations Center. This is something that I will define them. Most organizations do not actually deploy them in exactly this way, but really need to deal with all of these capabilities. So I've identified the functions that are present. Also, not going to talk at the moment about software and hardware to make this SOC happen, the interactions between the capabilities, or the interactions from the SOC out to other parts of the organizations. I'll talk later about people, skill sets, the other things that are necessary for those people to be effective in the SOC. And I've got a long list of processes, but for now, I just want to talk about the specific components that need to be present for security operations. You might label things differently. You might have different names to associate with these teams, all sorts of crazy acronyms. That's great. You might have a group of people that do all of these things. But if you have a group of people and they're not doing all these things, then you're really missing out on what it is to be a security operations center. You might also have some parts of this be where you interface to an external entity for outsourcing. The first function that I'm identifying is the command center. This is something that, depending upon your capability and maturity, you might actually have dedicated staff who do this. This is more likely in smaller SOCs in the 10 size of people, a shared responsibility. This shared responsibility is something where we are providing a point of contact that receives and triages tasks. That is a fairly complex thing. It involves being aware of lots of different moving parts. It requires organizational awareness. It requires the ability to be able to perceive the appropriate relevance of requests. It requires the ability to interact with other people within the SOC in a non-intrusive way in order to get information. And this might be monitoring a communication stream like an ongoing chat room, or it might be reviewing hundreds of tickets and queues in order to make sense of who's supposed to actually pick up the task that's just come in. In addition to that, this command center is intended to be the emanation of communication out to the organization. When I talk about incident response, I think that in the midst of a response, we want the responders directly interfacing. But in general practice, the command center is where communication comes out of the SOC. There's also probably a sub-function for the command center, and I put it here because it has to do with the ongoing operations. It is the care and feeding of the systems that are present. This, depending upon how you architect things, this might be put into the network security monitoring capability. But it really is probably either infrastructure as part of the command center or infrastructure as part of network security monitoring, which is a function whose intention is to provide visibility on a massive volume of data and make a differentiation as to whether or not something is a problem or requires investigation in order to determine if it's a problem. There's loads of tech and people and training and analysis that goes into this, but overall, this concept, this function, I call network security monitoring. You might call it something different. You might object to the inclusion of network because it makes you think that you're excluding all the data elements that are at rest on individual endpoints. I call it network security monitoring over the practice of monitoring your network in order to identify flaws. Threat intelligence entails the notion of developing and consuming information about actors who are attempting to harm the organization and its assets. You can be a producer of threat intelligence. You can be a consumer of threat intelligence. You're more than likely both. And the overall intention of the threat intelligence capability is to provide both tactical and strategic advantage over the adversaries who are targeting you. This requires a tremendous amount of study, correlation of information, and then awareness of the organization itself in order to do this well. When we have identified a problem, typically via network security monitoring or occasionally through the command center where someone calls in and says, hey, I think we have a problem, we have the incident response function who is going to then attempt to minimize the damage from the incident. This is something where this might be outsourced. It frequently is, particularly for things which are not routine for the organization. Part of what incident response does is a thorough analysis and triage of the information that's been presented to them in order to understand what exactly is going on and how to deal with it. Overall, incident response is intended to minimize the impact of problems that have occurred or are currently occurring. To support this, we tend to do forensics. Forensics is a function, and in the way that I'm defining this, this is a deep dive, authoritative investigation of information assets. The incident response team might be doing something very similar, but they tend to do it from a triage perspective, whereas forensics is authoritative. This is the distinction that I have in terms of both functions might have processes to do effectively the same thing, but incident response is more likely to do it in an initial and a more superficial fashion. Host-based forensics includes all of our logs and details and the operating system and knowledge of all of the different operating systems that we have in play in our organization. Network forensics is the study of the assets that form our network and the log data that's available in them in order to depict things which have happened. Reverse engineering is the practice of inspecting software or hardware in order to identify what the program can do or might have done. This is something that requires a specific skill set. We typically don't have a lot of time and resources to do this. This is something that, if we do it well, is incredibly valuable and can feed information back into our threat intelligence, our incident response, and our other forensic functions. eDiscovery is something that I wouldn't advocate that you try to take it away from another team in your organization if it already exists. But if it doesn't exist and you're building a SOC, you should be thinking about how you can support this very important forensic investigation type because it is one that will occur frequently. The self-assessment function in my model includes configuration monitoring in order to both develop baselines, develop normal, and then track for deviation from those baselines. It includes vulnerability assessment in order to check deployed systems against an inventory of known flaws and to advocate for change within the organization to make sure that those flaws get remediated. Pen testing is the demonstration of the impact of flaws which are present. And finally, exercises are the behavior measured both by the SOC and by portions of the organization outside of the SOC. So configuration monitoring includes things like integrity monitoring, baseline development, deviation authorization, and then checking for that variation over time. Vulnerability scans are what the vulnerability assessment does, but this function is really there to make sure that the organization does something about the things that were actually identified. Pen testing usually leverages the sort of information that's collected in a vulnerability scan in order to demonstrate what could actually happen and go wrong if one of the flaws that is latent in the system is leveraged by a threat which is attacking us. And exercises are something that we all tend to avoid because we're too busy. And the way that we relieve ourselves of being too busy is by doing exercises to make ourselves better at things, to make them more routine. This can be either a vicious or a virtuous cycle, depending upon how you approach the idea of exercises.